Hello, and welcome to Season 6 of Beyond Teaching, a podcast from the Psych Sessions Network. I'm Eric Landrum from Boise State University, one of Beyond Teaching's 3 co-hosts. My other 2 co-hosts are Susan Nolan from Seton Hall University and Adeyinka Ikinsular-Smith from the City College of New York. These 4 episodes of Season 6 were recorded from March of 2023 through July of 2023, and they are dropped for a special Leap Day release on February 29th, 2024. In some ways, this is a mini-season with 4 episodes to present. Episode 1 features 2 international doctoral students at the time of the recording, and this episode is amazing. It's where I learned about deficit-based cultures and strengths-based cultures. In episode 2, Yinka, Susan, and I discuss email etiquette, which appears to be an ongoing challenge for many folks in higher education. In episode 3, Susan and I get a chance to discuss leadership transitions in one's career, addressing the joys as well as the drawbacks. We closed the Leap Day mini-session release with episode 4, where Susan and I welcome special guest Sue Frantz. We get a chance to discuss multiple recent transitions for Sue, as well as new challenges. It's all part of the knowledge and skills that psychology professionals need to know about. The stuff that we were not taught in graduate school. That is, beyond teaching. Welcome to Season 6.
Well, hello, and welcome back to another episode of Beyond Teaching. You know, we say this every time, but what a special treat today that we have. I'm Eric Landrum from Boise State University. I'm going to let my colleague introduce herself, and then we have a special guest.
And I'm Susan Nolan from Seton Hall University, and I will let our special guest introduce herself.
I am Sue Frantz, and where I am is kind of up in the air. I guess it's not really up in the air. I was formerly at Highline College in Seattle, but I retired in September, and I now live in southern New Mexico, and I'm occasional affiliate faculty for New Mexico State University.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Many affiliations. You're not a person without a country, but many people will claim your affiliation. What an honor to have you, Sue.
Thank you so much, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here.
We also should note that you have a new role with the Society for the Teaching of Psychology as the Assistant Executive Director, which is exciting as well.
Yeah, it is exciting. It's the first time the society has had an Assistant Executive Director. And I am learning all kinds of things, you know, as former president, as both of you have been, you learn quite a bit, but boy, I'm way down in the weeds now.
I can only imagine. When I was president, I thought almost every day how lucky we are to have an executive director as an organization. And I can totally see why we needed to have also an assistant executive director. It's a ton of work. Today, we are going to talk.
Hey, Susan, I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm going to interrupt before we get to our
Please,
topic.
go ahead and interrupt.
Sue, if you don't mind, can you share what's the most surprising thing you've learned about STP? Because you're right. You've been an STP member 15, 20 years, as Susan and I have been. You've served as STP president. You are VP. I've known your work way back from topics and project syllabus. So can you share one surprise that you've learned just going through archives or work with Tom Pusateri and the current team at STP?
I think I don't know if it was surprising, but the thing with the most moving parts is just how to manage STP membership. We have about 3,000 members, and there are 3 different ways that you can join. You can join by going directly to the STP website, teachpsych.org, and joining there, $25, easy peasy. You can join whenever you re-up your APS membership for those who are APS members. Or you can join when you re-up your APA membership. You check the box that says Division 2, Society for the Teaching of Psychology. You pay your $25 as part of that, and you're in. But because people can join through any of those 3 mechanisms, we end up with Tom ends up with 3 different databases that he has to reconcile. And some of those are easier to manage than others are.
When you said 3 databases that Tom has to reconcile, both Susan and I simultaneously had scrunchy faces on our Zoom screens at the exact same time. Yeah, I'm surprised there's 3 on-ramps is a lot. I'm surprised there's not more, but 3 sounds like a lot. So thank you for sharing that. Susan, I'm so sorry I interrupted you so rudely. Now
No
back to our
problem.
regularly scheduled programming.
Well, we had discussed talking with Sue about the kinds of academic writing that many of us do that are not journal articles. So this can be everything from blogs to maybe even social media to textbooks, book chapters, but let's stay away from the book chapters that are more academic in nature, more based on scholarships. I think it's really exciting for many of us in our jobs that we have the opportunity to branch out beyond that traditional writing and do some cool stuff. And all 3 of us have written outside of that box of peer-reviewed journals. So Eric or Sue, would one of you like to kick it off?
Well, Sue, I think you've had a really particularly successful blog, Technology for Educators, and I'm not quite sure 6, 7, 10 years now. And was that maybe your first foray into public writing? Talk a little bit about that if you would.
Sure, that's SueFrantz.com. And it started off as Technology for Educators. And then at some point, I amended it to Technology for Academics.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah. And there was a reason I did that. But first, yeah, that was really, I think you're right, Eric. I think that was my first foray into public writing. And and I didn't start that blog for all of you. Actually, I started it for me because I was learning how to do all these cool things with technology. And then months would go by, and I'm like, wait, I already learned how to do that, but I haven't been using it. How do I do that again? And I have to go and look it up again. So I really just started Technology for Academics as a way to maintain my own database. So that way I could search my blog, like, oh, yeah, I did. How did I do that? Oh, right. That was the keyboard shortcut. So yeah, and that blog, boy, I'd have to check my CV, but I'm pretty sure that I started that about 10 years ago.
Yeah, and those can be really amazingly successful. We interviewed Jessica Hartnett for a Psych Sessions interview, I don't know, maybe a year and a half ago. And she shared with us that when she applied for promotion and tenure, I may not get all the words right in the right order. Her Not Awful and Boring Statistics blog, when she went up for promotion and tenure, she had gone back and looked at all of her blog accesses and downloads and she had, I want to say 450,000 people who had accessed her blog over 10, 12 years. And it's really a way that it's a non-traditional approach to have impact in our discipline without article submissions, traditional book chapters, textbooks. And that's not to criticize the traditional ways we make an impact, but 450,000 people reading a blog over 10 years is more people that are going to ever read all of my journal articles combined.
Yeah, and I wondered if Sue, if you could talk a little bit about building an audience for a blog like that.
I
How
honestly,
did you go about doing that?
I didn't put any effort into marketing, actually, because it was meant as my own personal database. So I would mention it. I would occasionally do a presentation and I would mention it, and people would go and they'd put in their email address. They would sign up in order to get, and the only time I use it is when a new blog post goes up. I don't sell those email people who have subscribed. I don't sell those to anybody. So it's just new blog post goes up. If you're signed up, you get an email. Well, it starts to ripple through the teaching of psychology community, and then it expanded beyond the teaching of psychology community. So it ripple or snowball, because I guess snowball is probably the better metaphor, because I would get invited then to present on technology, and there are people who are listening who very kindly invited me to their institution or to their conference to talk about whatever technology related. So I did that, which then just advertises the blog more, and so more people end up subscribing. Now, I think it's interesting that we're spending so much time talking about this particular blog, because I've my writing energy has been directed in so many other directions that if you're subscribed to the blog, you know that, wait, I haven't gotten an email about a new blog post in a few months. I've got a long list of things I want to write about, but I've got these other writing projects that are sucking up my time right now. Good writing projects, excellent, fantastic writing projects. I'm not complaining about these writing projects. It's just, there are still only so many hours in a day.
I wondered if I could ask about for Macmillan Learning, where you give examples that could be used particularly in introductory psychology classroom. And I guess my main question for you for that is, and apologies, my house is getting renovated. You can probably hear that, listeners. I wonder if you could talk about how you get your ideas for those blog posts.
Oh, let's see. So for Macmillan Communities, I do a blog 4 times a month. And the ideas for that, so it's teaching psychology, so it can be just about any topic. I have a news feed. I use a Newsreader, and the one I prefer is called Ino Reader, INO Reader. That's a nice segue between the technology and into psychology. So through there, I have all kinds of stuff coming in. I got the psych journal table of contents that come in through there. I got science-related news stories from the New York Times that comes through there, and a couple handfuls of other sites that I subscribe to. And I'm just looking for something that jumps out at me, and that frankly comes from teaching intro psych for over 30 years. Not over 30 years, just about 30 years. So, because I'm so familiar with intro psych and the content of intro psych, it's at some point I just got in the habit of, oh, here's a good example that will really work for this chapter the next time I lecture on that. So what I do is I tag all of these things that are coming in, and if I think it's going to be it could be an interesting article, an interesting blog post, then that's what I do. I just tag it with Macmillan blog. And then when I sit down to write, I just flip through everything that I've got tagged for that until something jumps out. I'm like, oh, this will be easy and fun to write about.
So I think there's a theme emerging here.
Go ahead, Eric.
And Sue, dissuade me of this if I'm getting it wrong, which I could be. But you started this writing project kind of as a helpful thing to you, but it took a little bit of extra work to share it. I mean, you had to learn the blog software, and then you have an email distribution list. And that's a very kind and generous thing that you do. And people who know you knows that it was very kind and generous. And that was for free. And it still is for free when you do post the technology for academics. But then that turns into, and you weren't overly commercial about it, as you've said, but then it turns into other opportunities. So then occasionally you start getting asked to speak at a conference, and then you get a chance to promote yourself and advance your career, and advances the blog. And then you get asked to write for Macmillan. And I don't want to be too personal, but I'm assuming that's a paid gig, right?
It is.
So,
It is.
So that's a good thing for your career, right? I mean, we all want paid gigs. I mean, pro bono doesn't work to pay the bills. And so there is that snowball effect where you've got some rhythm and momentum going, but it started truly out of the goodness of your heart. And I don't know if this leap is appropriate or not, but maybe all of that writing and the giving talks and the momentum helps you land some textbook writing contracts and writing some textbooks now. I mean, that may not be a linear line. That's redundant. That may not be a linear line, but am I being fair in connecting some of the dots there?
I would say that it is linear. That's exactly how it went down. So you wanna hear the timeline?
Yes, please.
So okay. So I'm doing technology for academics. I'm putting this stuff up. And and Eric, I appreciate what you're saying about the time involved in doing it. Um yeah, but it wasn't. WordPress is my blogging platform. It's not hard to learn. I've got it set up so it runs through Microsoft Word. So I just go to Word and I say create new blog post. I write it all there and then I click a publish button and then there, it's now available on the website.
I know it's not hard for you, but those steps are not intuitive to all of our listeners. Trust me.
I think I did a blog post on how to start your own blog, actually.
I'll bet you did.
Right,
There's a
meta.
meta thing going on here where the snake is eating its tail, I think. Yeah.
Yes. So so now I get invited to conferences, right? So I've spoken at a number of conferences. Several of you have seen me at a number of those conferences
Me too.
talking about technology. So one of those happened to be VicTop, the Vancouver International Conference on Teaching of Psychology, which no longer exists. And I was giving a talk there on technology, and who was sitting in the audience but Doug Bernstein. So this is the first time that Doug has seen my technology talk. He absolutely falls in love with a number of these technologies. And as he will tell you, he didn't actually use any of them yet. It took him a while to work up to it, but eventually he did. So he invites me to speak in Vienna. APS is having their international conference on whatever their teaching conference is called, Susan. I don't remember it.
ICPS, International Congress on Psychological Science.
Thank you. So Doug was organizing the teaching part of that particular conference. So he invites me there to talk about technology. So Doug shows up at my presentation again. He sees that my presentation wasn't a one-off thing. And next thing I know, Doug is asking me if I would be interested in joining him on his book, Teaching Psychology. It was a book that he had done a couple editions with Sandy Goss Lucas, and Sandy had decided that she wasn't interested in taking it into another edition. So he asked me if I would be interested. And of course, there's a technology chapter in there that he immediately pegged me for, and we talked about a couple others. So Steve Chu and I said, "Yeah, Doug, we will join you on this textbook." It did pretty well in the last edition, and we have just started working on the next edition of that. All right. So now Doug has this experience with me of knowing I know something about technology, knowing that I can speak on the topic, and he has seen my blog posts. He knows that I've got some writing skills. He's now worked with me on this book, so he knows that I am capable of participating in a longer project. So, long story short, Flat World Publishers comes to him and says, "Hey, we got an intro psych textbook. We're looking for a new author on it. Do you know anybody?" And Doug said, "Well, I had other plans for her, and I hate to give her up, but here you go." So that's how I ended up with Flat World. So you're absolutely right, Eric. This thing that started off as a thing I did for free, just sitting at home, typing stuff up, turned into speaking engagements, which turned into invitations to co-author a book, which turned into a bigger invitation to co-author a textbook.
First off, Susan, thank you for sharing that story. And secondly, what's the approximate timeline? Is that 15 years from the start of the blog to today? Is that 12 years? Is that 18 years? If you can just ballpark it.
I'm going to guess 12 years.
Okay. So I think for our listeners, and gosh, for me, for that matter, you know, higher ed asks a lot of things for free. And interestingly, no one in higher ed asked Sue to do this. Sue decided to do it on her own. This was something I'm going to call it a labor of love. If that's too strong, you can correct me. But it sounds like it was a labor of love. And I don't, first off, our listeners, you should know Sue's really smart. She's one of the smartest people I know. But I don't even think Sue knew 12 years ago that writing this blog was going to lead to intro psych and the social psych textbook 12 years later. That would be
14. 14. I just checked my CV. 14 years.
Well, thank God for technology. 14 years later, I mean, we all, none of us know how our careers are going to unfold, but we like to talk about things beyond teaching, and writing is certainly beyond teaching. And we're not taught these things in graduate school. I don't know a graduate program that teaches blog writing or podcast recording for that matter. But these are things that, add to the enjoyment of our careers that may not turn into something financial, but certainly can turn into something rewarding.
And it's interesting because I've been reading some of the articles out there about fraud being uncovered in different sciences. And a lot of that is originating on people's blogs. So, there's the sharing of information like Sue is talking about. And then there's these different blogs. HubPeer is one of them I was just reading about, where people are writing about sketchy things that they're seeing in research. And that's another way that people can contribute. And I think that the 14-year timeline, I think about myself getting into textbook writing and how long that took. I think about the fact that you mentioned Jess Hartnett earlier, Eric, and she did her blog for a really long time. And now she's about to release a statistics textbook. So it is really interesting if you do something kind of as a fun side pursuit and you're good at it. I think it can turn into a bigger project and something that might even make money.
You're good at it and you're passionate about it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, you've had similar paths through a number of different writing projects yourself, Eric.
Yeah, I had help from the beginning. I published my first book in 2000 with Steve Davis, who at the time was at Emporia State in Kansas. And we wrote together a textbook called The Psychology Major, Strategies for Undergraduate Student Success. And it was because I had his shoulders to stand on. And I am first author on that book, and he is still a co-author, even though he's retired. He's how I broke into the publishing world. Like we've been kind of hinting about, we don't get taught textbook writing in graduate school or blogging or podcast recording. You figure it out on your own. I don't know how the two of you, actually, we kind of know Sue's story of breaking into it. Susan, we'll need to hear your story if you want to share it, how you broke into it. But I broke into it because I had a mentor. I had a direct mentor who was willing to be patient with me. Steve had written another intro psych textbook with Joe Palladino. He had written research methods textbook with Randy Smith. He was prolific already with journal articles with students. And I was just another one of his students who happened to be a faculty member. And that's how I broke into that. And I do think that in the publishing world, and I'd be interested to know if you both agree with this or not. I think the publishing world is a club, and it's a bit of an exclusive club. And once you're in, you're in. Once you publish it's hard to publish your first book, but once you publish your first book, it's much easier to publish your second book and your third book and your fourth book, even with a different publisher, because you have a record. It's almost like a SAG-AFTRA card, or a Screen Actors Guild card. Once you get the card, you can get into that next movie a lot easier than it is getting your first movie and your SAG card.
I mean, my story's a pretty quick one. I became friends with the book rep, and she got to know how I taught statistics over drinks. We became real friends. Like I went to her wedding eventually. And then she said, she was at Thompson Learning, which is now Cengage. She said, we're looking for a stats book. And the way you approach it seems, like it would be a good match. And I'm like, oh my God, I could never write a statistics textbook. from scratch. And then a couple weeks later, she comes back. She's like, well, I have this other friend. His name is Tom Heinzen. We've become good friends. And I said the same thing to him. And he said the same thing you did. What if you two wrote it together? I think you'd like each other. So Tom and I met up. We call it a blind date for collaboration at a diner at noon. And we closed it down 4 hours later with a plan and ended up going with Worst Publishers. But yeah, that was how I ended up in it. And then, like you said, Sandy Hockenberry was solo taking over the intro book she had written with Dawn Hockenberry. I got pulled into that project.
But
yeah,
Susan,
the was just kind of random.
But Susan, once you started talking to Sandy, you had street cred because you had 4 or 5 editions already of Nolan and Heinzen.
No, exactly. And then I'm agreeing with you. Once I did the stats book, that's why I got considered for that project. And sort of coincidentally, maybe not so coincidentally, when I was writing the stats book, I used Hockenberry as one of my models to get sort of ideas, and they start every chapter with a narrative. And that's why I did the same thing with statistics. So I think in some ways, my sort of mimicking the style of the Hockenberry intro book made me seem like a kind of a potential choice, because she didn't know that till later when I told her that, oh, actually, I even had pictures of myself with Hockenberry open next to my laptop as evidence.
Well, I just never thought I had that far, and I don't know if Sue did either. But Sue, thank goodness that you've retired. But thank goodness you've retired, because now you have time for all these writing projects.
That's right. I do, and it's the only way that I would. I did teach part-time this past academic year, and what I discovered is that if I am teaching, it is really hard for me to carve out the brain space to write.
Yeah, that teaching gig must really get in the way of your writing gig.
Gigs. Yeah, it's a challenge.
Gigs. Okay, there you go. There you go. So what would aspiring, maybe we have listeners who are in graduate school or early in their career, colleagues who are assistant professors who, maybe they've got that great idea. Maybe it's not the great American novel, but they've got the great American textbook in their sights or somewhere in their career. What advice might we give them as I'm not going to say old, seasoned, experienced writers of multiple genres?
Well, I will say one thing before we return to our guests. If you are in a type of track where you're going to get tenure or some kind of a security or promotion, if you're on a different type of whatever, get that promotion, because unfortunately textbooks don't quote unquote count to the same degree as other things. And so make sure that you're not derailing your career by doing it too early. And again, if that's the kind of track that you're on.
But you could be doing some of the things that Sue did that count, like presentations at conferences.
Absolutely. Yeah.
One of the things that I accidentally stumbled into is I started doing research about books or research about the topics that I would later write about. When I started writing, I noticed there were gaps in the literature, and those gaps in the literature became part of my research program. So I might not have written about the book. I mean, I got my PhD in 1940. And then I published my first book in 2000. So I had almost 2 decades of time to think about things before I got to my first book. So I think, Susan, you're right.
Teaching examples too. You can be, keeping all your teaching examples in an organized form, such as maybe what Sue is describing. Because a lot of my examples I use in the books are examples I first used in the classroom. How about you, Sue? What's your advice for the aspiring textbook or other type of book author?
Well, I'm trying to picture who that person might be, because when I think back to grad school, the last thing I was thinking about was writing a textbook. Just, oh my God. Like, what must you have to know to write a textbook? And just in working on revising this intro psych textbook that I recently finished, that I learned so much through that well, first, intro psych is just freaking hard. Just because we're experts in 1, 2, maybe 3 chapters, and all the rest is like I have no idea what any of this stuff is. So learn, talk with people who are experts, learn some more. Okay, now I'll try and put on my teaching cap and imagine that I am writing for my students, because I was. So I don't know that there are a whole lot of people who are in graduate school who are imagining one day writing a textbook. I would be surprised if any textbook authors that we know, and we know quite a few, if we asked them, was this your plan in graduate school? I would be shocked if any of them said, yep, that was exactly my plan. I don't think we start off planning to write textbooks. I think textbook authorship is thrust upon us.
Well, I might be the exception to that because in grad school,
Of course. And here we go.
Oh.
Here we go.
So one of my dear friends to this day was a grad school classmate named Laura Naney, and we led very different lives. She went on to Emory University, and we knew she was going that R1. Now she's working with different organizations in the field. And I knew I wanted to go someplace where teaching was valued. Laura's a wonderful teacher. We TA'd together when we were young, but she wanted that more. And so we said, and she's cognitive, and I'm like weird, clinical, social. There's no way we'll ever get to work together unless someday we read a textbook together. And so in grad school, that was our way to maybe someday get to work together. Now, of course, we each independently wrote textbooks with other folks. We're intro to psych competitors. But yeah, in grad school, Laura and I actually talked about that as a way to work together one day. So
What was Laura's last name?
It was a dream of working with Laura. Namey, Namy. It was a dream of working with Laura, not a dream of writing a textbook per se.
Okay, that's a whole different thing. That's a whole, yeah, okay. So, but for me, even it was, I could not imagine writing something of that length, of textbook length. I couldn't. But I could do short form writing. I can do technical writing, which is essentially what the technology blog posts are. And that felt easy to me because it felt like teaching. Like, here, let me tell you exactly how to do this. Step 1, step 2, step 3. Let me get into your head so I know where it is that you're coming from. And I know you're going to have a hard time with this part, Eric. So let me write this specifically for you. So the short form writing came pretty easily, which then became presentations, which is just another form of teaching. And then when Doug offered, okay, and there were other chapters that I was part of, but to be part of a book and assign these 3 chapters, that felt a little different. So, okay, I can do these chapters. I can do this. And then when the textbook came, it was, okay, I cannot think about this as a textbook. I can't think of it as a book. Instead, I don't even think I can think of it as a whole bunch of chapters. I had to really break each chapter down into its smaller components and say, this is just short form writing, and I'm just going to do a bunch of short form writing. And that felt doable to me, and it was.
You're going to do short form writing 440 times.
That's exactly right.
What I'm realizing as I listen to all of our stories is that in the writing that we've talked about here, we all had an advocate or a mentor. Mine was Steve Davis. Sue's was Doug Bernstein. Susan, yours was the textbook rep who came to you
and
said,
also Tom Heinzen, who is a wonderful writer. And
but it would have, Tom wasn't the trigger. It was the textbook rep to put the idea in your head. you know you can do this and you'd be good at it. And then Tom helped make it happen. Tom wasn't a priori, Tom was a posteriori. But 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 we all had those trigger people's not the right
Yeah.
word. It's not a good word. Some sort of advocate on
Mhm.
our side who saw the potential in us that we could do this thing that maybe we didn't think we saw that we could do. And I think maybe that's what future textbook writers need. Wherever they are in their career, someone needs to see in them, or future writers of things beyond journal articles and book chapters, someone needs to see in them, you know, you can do this other thing if you wanted to. I
Yeah.
don't know.
Bef- be-
I have one more topic, but Susan, you go ahead and go
I
first.
know. If we're wrapping up, I was just going to ask Sue if there's anything aside from what we've been talking about this whole time, if there's something she can pinpoint that she wished she had learned in graduate school, something beyond teaching that she wished she had learned. And if you want to ask your follow-up question, Eric, we can give Sue a moment to
Yeah,
think about it if she wants
yeah.
to.
So, and I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I think there's something related here in OER, open educational resources. The I think it's an amazing opportunity at times for some students to have access to resources. I know OER doesn't mean free. It's more complicated than that. But I think a lot of faculty associate OER with free. I have two chief concerns about OER: sustainability and fact checking, for lack of a better term. And so we've been talking about how, although writing efforts might not have started with the idea of making money and capitalism, which I'm a fan of, by the way, that's one of the big concerns I have with OER. Asking someone or a team of someone's to spend months, if not years, writing a textbook on a topic, including intro psych, and saying, no, 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 I'm not going to take any pay for it. Let's gift it to students at a university or worldwide or the English speaking community. I, it's not a sustainable model. And I actually think it hurts some sectors of faculty more than others. If I were to do that, I'm a 60-year-old white male, and I might be in a point in my career where I could gift that if I had it to gift. Ask a 30-something faculty member on a tenure track. That's a harder thing to ask someone to write an OER and give it away if they're raising a family or they're a minoritized faculty member, to gift away that amount of effort for an OER textbook. And so I have a sustainability problem with OER. And then I know for mainstream textbooks like the two of you have written, big intro psych type stats, social psych, it gets sent off to 25 reviewers who fact check the heck out of that thing chapter by chapter. I'm not so sure that happens with every OER implementation. So I don't know if we want to go down that rabbit hole. I can edit out that soliloquy. I can do that in Audacity. I can edit that out. I think there's a difference in what we ask of faculty when they donate to OER efforts.
I mean, I largely agree with you, Eric. There are different levels of OER, but a lot of it doesn't have all the support things that come with a publisher textbook, like PowerPoint slides, test banks, and all that stuff. It's less common. And I think there's an equity issue with adjuncts. If universities are requiring OER and you have adjuncts that are teaching maybe 8 classes across 3 institutions and they're having to use OER, so I think there's some real equity issues in our field. It's one thing if you've got the time to use OER and supplement it. I also have had multiple people tell me that they use OER, but they like my book, so they use it for the examples. So I think, and some people I know use materials that they got from the publisher in the past. So I do think that there's some problematic issues. On the other hand, one of the things I think OER did is it drove the prices down of the traditional textbooks. because they were forced to come up with different models, whether it's like a loose leaf if they want the print or an EPUB. So the books that I write are now much less expensive than they used to be. So I think that was a good correction. And also, I've quoted Dave Myers even on this podcast before, but Dave points out that his book is not just him. And this is true for everybody who writes intro books and other similar books. It's not just him, it's his whole team of fact checkers and editors and photo researchers and artists who make the graphs and the brain drawings and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and David Daniel has pointed out over the years that students who are perhaps the most in need of all of these extras to support are the ones, he likens it to a food desert. Students with fewer economic resources are more likely to end up with OER. And again, there are some exceptions that are quite good, but a lot of it, and there's even been people who've done research on this, a lot of it is just not updated. It's not as strong. It's not as fact checked. If I didn't have the layers of help on my book, I'm sure I would have, I'm sure there are errors anyway. I'm sure there'd be more. So I largely agree with you.
Well, I'm not going to disagree.
You're welcome to.
I talked to a faculty member just a few months ago who was telling me that they had been doing OER for the last 7 years. And it sounded like they had been curating materials and putting it into a course that everybody else at her institution used for this particular course. And she was telling me that it was every weekend she is spending 2, 3, 4 hours going through that material to make sure that it's current, that it is still available, that whatever has to happen. And I couldn't help but think about how many hours I put into revising that intro psych textbook and how many hours I'm putting into revising the social psych textbook. It's a bunch of hours.
Yeah.
And I can't even quantify it. So to do that for absolutely free while I'm also trying to teach a full load, I just can't even fathom that. I think it's an unrealistic ask for instructors. But I think, Susan, you're absolutely right. I think it has been a message to the publishers that, yeah, you got to make your books affordable.
So, Susan, you wanted to close on something and then we'll sign off.
Yeah, I just wondered if Sue might want to share something she wished she learned in graduate school.
Well, it's essentially this topic that I think that we need to do more in graduate school in teaching our students how to write for the general public. That we end up with all of this fantastic psychological knowledge. We know all kinds of stuff. If nothing else, we know research methods. And to be able to communicate that to a general audience, even if you're just starting with your Facebook friends, that to think about, yeah, you know this stuff. And like, here's all this research on helping, for instance. Well, here, how about you share some of what you know about helping and how valuable it is for our own well-being when we help others? Isn't that great and wonderful? So how about communicating that in some form? It could be a blog post. It could be a social media post. You can put it out on X, for the love of God. So
Threads.
Threads.
Those names might have changed by the time this airs.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. If Elon Musk has his way, they will.
Totally. Well, you're just going to have to look it up on Wikipedia. So I think that we could do more in that regard. Instead of writing for other academics, how about we got some really important stuff that we know? Let's help people communicate that. I think Jessica's blog is a great example of that.
Yeah.
So I think that we should be doing more of that, teaching that kind of writing and value it more. That we should be doing psychology in the public interest.
Wait, I can't agree with you more, Sue. That the science communication piece of our discipline, although there are people concentrating on it, there should be more concentration. And that's really a skill that our psychology undergraduates who are going directly into the workforce could really take with them becoming ambassadors of our science and going into the workforce and being able to explain all the things that they learned while they were undergraduates to whatever workforce they're going into, whatever workplace they're going into. I have one last thing about textbooks I want to harken back to, and this is completely true. I wish it weren't. When I was straight out of grad school, very beginning assistant professor, here's what I would do. I would find the very best textbook for my students at the time, and I would not adopt it. I would keep it. And then I would find the second best textbook, and that's the one I would adopt for my students, because I would keep the best textbook for my notes that I needed for my lectures. And I would keep that comp copy and write my lectures from that book. And I would adopt the second best book because I was fresh out of graduate school. I was 26 years old, and I was about 8 minutes ahead of my students when I walked into the classroom. I had just finished my lecture notes back in 19. So I'm not really proud of that. That's where I was.
Just don't tell the author, because then
Oh, yeah, the funny thing is, I know the authors. I know the authors personally now, which is really crazy. But I knew them 34 years ago. I didn't know them 34 years ago. I knew their names, but I know them now. Crazy.
Well, what you did, Eric, was the advice I was explicitly given. I was told explicitly, and it wasn't framed as best, second best. It's okay, you're going to use a book that is written mid-level, but get a book that is written top level. That's going to be your reference. But the book you're going to use with your students is going to be that mid-level book.
I hate that level crap.
Well,
you can't use Gazanaga at Boise State. It's too high level for your students. You got to use a mid-level book. I've never liked that level designation, but I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
If the book includes information on the sodium potassium pump, it is too high a level for what I want.
Well, with a nod to our beloved friend Scott Lilienfeld, if it had dark adaptation, we've got to take a second look at whether we really need to teach dark adaptation. May he rest in peace. And that's an inside story we'll tell some other time.
It's a great story.
And we've been talking with our special guest, Sue Frantz. Thank you for joining us today, Sue.
Thank you both very much. Always a pleasure.